My name is Bridget Cage. I work for the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the RTSC with our SESPs. It's a lot of initials. And I'm here to introduce Christine Riley, who's the owner and is of, Cape Cod Advocate. You opened that in 2005 to provide educational consultation and advocacy for children of all ages and disabilities. Since then, you've advocated for hundreds of families in every school district on Cape Cod and the islands. You've trained as an education advocate and parent consultant through the Federation for Children with Special Needs, Rights Law, Suffolk Law Advanced Legal Studies, SCAT, and ISEA. Thank you so much for presenting today on writing social and emotional goals.
Thanks, everyone. So I believe I can share my screen. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, let me start with that then. And so thanks everyone for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me along the way, or if you would prefer to put the questions in the chat box, I'm certainly happy.
Yep, there's a Q&A section.
Okay,
and
great.
Then we'll stop as we go.
Okay. So I was asked to do a workshop called Writing Social Emotional Goals and supporting students through IEPs. So just a brief history. Back in 2010, the state legislature enacted the Massachusetts anti-bullying law. And that is sort of the foundation for social emotional learning, believe it or not. So it was designed to prevent bullying in schools, and it was divided into two parts. One applies to students in schools, and the other one applies to students who are eligible for special education. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed took that information and created a technical assistance advisory. And that was issued to all school districts that shows that students need to develop skills to respond to bullying, harassment, and teasing, and that it should be added to the individuals with an IEP. That at that time in 2011, the state sort of partnered with the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. It's called CASEL. And at that point, the state anticipated coming up with a curriculum for all school districts. And then they backed that back a little bit and said, instead of us coming up with the curriculum, we're going to issue guidance and allowing school districts to identify their own curriculum. So that's what school districts have been doing since then. I just wanted to take this time and even though we're in COVID and school looks very different this year, the state came out saying that even during pandemic times, our jobs as educators is to create a safe and healthy learning environment that is full of joy, engaging, and equitable for every child. So I think that's, very important to remind us all, including school administrators, teachers, parents, surrogate parents, anybody who is supporting students. Our number one goal is to make sure that we are providing a healthy learning environment. So as an educational surrogate parent, you have a very important role. You have been granted a significant decision-making authority, and that you're to be involved in every step of the special education process. That includes identifying children who may have a disability and may require the supports of an IEP. Help through the evaluation process, participate in the eligibility process to determine how that disability impacts access to learning and how to develop an IEP. And then placement, that's where the IEP is implemented. And then overarching, what we're trying to do is make sure that these students with disabilities have a free and appropriate public education. Very good friend of mine says, that free also needs to be ambitious. Sometimes that is lacking. So as a surrogate parent, just make sure that you have that ambitious hat on as you're working with school districts and parents and students. So the role of the role as a surrogate parent is to be the expert on the child. And what I have found in the years that I've provided advocacy is that so many times we come in with blinders and we're only focused on this one school year. And your job as that surrogate parent is, yes, focus on that school year, but make sure that the blinders are expanded a little bit so that we have the vision of the whole child and our long-term goals of for that child. So one of the ways as a surrogate is to be effective is to make sure you understand the whole child. So I highly recommend, when it's safe to do so, is to go observe a child at school. That's very different this year because of COVID, and some school districts are not allowing non-employees to go into the building. But you can also sort of observe through Zoom and that kind of stuff. You just have to be creative. It's not something that you do just walk in one day and say, hey, I'm here to observe Charlie. You want to reach out to the school district, explain who you are, show your credentials and your consent form and all that kind of stuff, and then ask, is there a convenient time that I could come in and observe that child? I highly recommend that you see the child in the home environment and in the community, because that gives you a wealth of information on how the child is navigating through those social expectations. I strongly recommend that you review the child's school records if you have questions on how to get them. I'm certainly happy to answer that at the end. It's usually done through a written communication, just asking for records. I would keep it limited. You don't need, for an 11th grader, you don't need from kindergarten, back. And learn about the child's disability. So many students who are involved in the surrogate parent program have an underlying trauma exposure. And the Federation for Children with Special Needs has come out with some really good material for reading. These are the books on the right-hand side, Helping Traumatized Children to Learn, and Creating and Advocating for Trauma-Sensitive Schools. So as a parent, as a surrogate parent, you have some superpower. And one of those is to ask questions. Ask as many questions to as many people, because getting answers to those questions provides you with a better understanding of the child's needs. So how does a child learn? What is the favorite part of the school day? What is the least favorite part of the school day? Sometimes that will give you an indication of where they're struggling. So if yes, they may have trauma, but they may have an underlying reading disability. So if they really dislike literature circle or English, we get some information on that. And then does your child have friends at school, or are they having problems getting along on the at recess? And what is the child's general feelings about school? Is he happy to be there? Oops. In addition, there's lots of other ones. What games does the child like to play? Do they play alone or with other students? What motivates a child? Is it verbal praise? Is it earning tokens? Is the child afraid of anything? Especially for children who have experience with trauma, some things can be traumatizing or triggering. So empty rooms could be a trigger. It could be not knowing what to expect, so an unstructured schedule. Are they independent of adults, or are they dependent on adults? That exactly is going to tell us exactly what's going on, and give us more insight into that child. So the answers to all those questions will help you become a more effective surrogate parent. You'll be able to communicate the needs of the child. That will feed into the quantifiable information that you can provide to the school staff that are supporting the student. That in turn creates a better foundation for an IEP, and then the long-term outcomes are impacted by that as well. So you have a lot of good information that we need. I'm going to just take a minute and step away and play this really great 3-minute video. It's all about social emotional learning.
Hold your hand up like this, fold your thumb in, close your fingers down. This is a model of your brain. So the eyes, if there's a head here, they'd be looking out the front this way. This is the outside of that brain, that wrinkly part you see when you see a brain. And at the very front, right behind your forehead here, the smart part, the prefrontal cortex. It makes the decisions. Now, hold your hand up like this, fold your thumb in, close your fingers down. This is a model of your brain. So the eyes, if there's a head here, they'd be looking out the front this way. This is the outside of that brain, that wrinkly part you see when you see a brain. And at the very front, right behind your forehead here, the smart part, the prefrontal cortex. It makes the decisions. Now, inside, you can't see it, but we're going to open it up like this, and we're going to see the thumb area and down here in the palm. These two areas work together. The limbic system, the emotions, the feelings part. When you feel scared, when you're really angry, when you're out of control and you're upset, you can't think straight. And here, the brain stem keeps your heart beating and your lungs breathing, and makes you move your hand away from a hot stove really quickly. These two areas work together, saves your life from a tiger. It sends out a warning signal, danger, danger, and our heart beats, we breathe fast and shallow, our muscles tense so that we can run or we can fight and save our lives. Which is very handy if a tiger is chasing you. Not so handy if you're sitting in a classroom. Now what happens? The alarm will go off, and they're false alarms. You know, false alarms in the school when the fire alarm goes off and there was no fire and we all have to leave the building anyway? Well, that's what happens here. Somebody might criticize you, or your teacher tells you to sit down and please do your work, and you get all upset. That's not a real alarm. You're not really in danger. Yet, the alarm is set and you flip your lid. You lose the smart part. And this part is now in control. What can you do to get this smart part back? Start breathing slow, in through your nose, out through your nose, way down into your belly. Let your shoulders go. Relax, relax. Relax your body and breathe. This will trick this part. Look what's happening. The smart part. You get your smart part back. Because whatever got you upset, most of the time, is a false alarm.
So I hope that was helpful. It sort of, to me, frames what social emotional learning is all about. So going on with the presentation, so trauma is ongoing exposure to neglect, abuse, homelessness, and violence that's causing learning and behavioral problems in children. And so they can look very different, and they can be characterized as like trouble forming relationships with peers, with foster parents, with surrogate parents, with their own parents, relationships with teachers and peers, poor self-regulation, negative thinking, hypervigilance. That's a very significant indication of trauma, and then executive function challenges. Many times, this also mimics other disabilities. So as a surrogate parent, make sure that you communicate to the team that this child has had trauma, if in fact they have, so that we make sure we're supporting them in that realm. So remember I talked about CASEL, and the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed coordinated with the Collaborative for Academic, Social, Emotional Learning. And as a result, CASEL identified 5 core competencies of social emotional learning. That's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationships, skills, and responsible decision-making. So school districts are now working to sort of take those core competencies and create a social emotional learning. So what is self-awareness? That's the ability to understand one's emotions. So integrating personal and social identities, identifying a person's your personal emotions, and linking those emotions to the feelings, values and thoughts that you're having, and then developing interest and a sense of purpose. Self-management is the ability to manage one's emotions. So identifying emotions, that's huge. So many students, especially younger students, don't understand what they're feeling. And so as adults, we're going to label those emotions so that they can understand and identify that emotion. And then using stress management strategies to manage those negative or scary emotions, and then exhibiting self-discipline and self-motivation. Oops. Social awareness is the ability to understand the perspective of others and emphasize with others. So many times students they're so focused on themselves that we need to teach them how to take other people's perspective and recognizing the strengths of others and understanding and expressing gratitude. I think sometimes this is overlooked, both, in home and at school. I think it's very important to understand and express your gratitudes of what is going well. The other One of the other competencies is relationship skills. So the ability to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships. So learning how to communicate effectively, practicing teamwork, looking on how to problem solve, resolving conflict constructively, and resisting, most important, resisting negative social pressure. Without a good understanding of relationship skills and those skills that you need, you're more receptive or exposed to negative social peer pressure. And then responsible decision making, learning how to make caring and constructive choices about your own personal behavior and social interactions. So learning how to make judgments after analyzing and the data and then considering the facts, and then anticipating the consequences of your behavior. I think everyone has trouble with that, especially many times teenagers. So CASEL came up with this great visual. And so you can see that the social emotional learning is at the center. And then they talk about the 5 core competencies and where they can be found in the classroom, school-wide policies and practices. And then hopefully that morphs into or carries over into the families and caregivers and then into the community. The idea is that if we are raising a community of children that have those competencies, it will help the society in a whole. So social emotional learning and trauma it many times is intertwined. So trauma and toxic stress can hinder a child's development, relationship, behavior, learning, making school very difficult and an uncomfortable experience. So trauma informed schools incorporate this social emotional learning and work on those 5 competencies. Once a child is feeling safe and is in a predictable, caring environment, many times their anxiety is reduced, and so then they are open to learning. So with all IEP goals, in this case, social emotional goals start with an assessment. So an assessment is done to help facilitate meaningful IEP goal development. We want to identify the unique features of the disability as it exists with this specific child. So, and social emotional assessments can be done in various ways. They can be done through observation. They can do through rating scales, survey questions by the student, by the teachers, by the surrogate parents, by the foster parents, all sorts of people who are involved, and then broad-based performance assessments. Some of those are like second step assessment. That's more of a general ed assessment. A social and skills improvement system rating scale seems to be most popular in this area. A behavior assessment system for children, that's a questionnaire just to see how they're managing it within the cross environment. So there'll be one for parents to fill out, one for teachers to fill out, and a self-report. I would ask that if a school district is doing a BASC for a specific student, that individual teachers fill out the worksheet or the questionnaire, sometimes they'll get a couple teachers together and they'll have a conversation about rating this child on these specific skill sets. And what I find is that it gets skewed. So I'd much rather have them do it in isolation and let the evaluator then interpret the results. And then a functional behavior assessment is very helpful. That identifies the antecedents of a behavior and the consequences of those behaviors, and many times is the foundation for a behavior plan. Many times can be done by a school psychologist. I prefer a board certified behavior analyst to do that. So IEP goals. Goals are the instructional roadmap. And so we're understanding that we've identified a lacking skill, and we're going to work on the current performance, what a measurable goal is, and then how is it implemented, or how's the recipe for the support. So this is part of an IEP. This is a goal sheet for an IEP. And you'll see up here, we would identify the student's name, the dates of the IEP. So if it was an IEP that was developed today, it would be November 17th, 2020, and it'll go to November 16th, 2021. The date of the birth of the child, and then the student ID. But what I really want to point out is that each goal has a number and it has a title. So in this example, it would be goal number 2, and it would be entitled self-regulation. So we want to identify the current levels of performance, what our measurable goal is, or what is our goal for the year of this IEP, and then what are the objectives or the tiny steps that the child and the person that's supporting them will be working on throughout the year. So current performance, this is where surrogate parents shine. You're going to be providing current information on what a child can do. It is the positive part of the goal. So data, as much data as you can jam into that current performance level, you're more likely to get a more measurable annual goal. So we're going to describe the child's learning strength and their weaknesses. So Jack is a very outgoing, self-assured child, but has a real hard time losing at the playground. In fact, over a period of observation, Jack was playing basketball 3 times and he had a fight with 2 students, 2 different fights. So we got some information in there. So we want to provide objective data from the child's evaluation results as well. So any of those BASC results or social skills assessments would be in here. Then the measurable goal is an annual goal that over the next 12 months, what are the skills that we are anticipating the child will acquire or accomplish? And I would say that it should be ambitious. You want to make sure that we're pushing a student to a little bit out of their comfort zone, but so that they can grow. I think sometimes we're afraid and we have lower expectations for some students. And so it can be lofty. I would just say that keep in mind, is it a skill set that can be accomplished with and truly mastered in that year. Oops. So benchmarks and objectives are those short-term steps that break down that giant skill, that measurable annual goal, into discrete component or sub-skills. So it's like riding a bike. You're going to ride slower. You're going to be a little wobbly initially, and then you're going to get it, and you're going to go, and you're going to be able to manage that bike ride. Some people refer to it as ladders too, as like steps in a ladder. So you start on the bottom rung, and you're going to work your way up the ladder. So measuring progress, how will we know? So for each goal, you as a surrogate parent, spend some time in reading that goal and see what tools will be used to measure and how will it be communicated. So in general, progress reports are issued as frequently as report cards, and they are written by the service provider of that goal. Do you remember we went back? Let me see if I can go back a little bit. Do you remember we talked about goal number 2 and the title? Well, you'll see in a few minutes, we're going to go over a service delivery grid, but we're going to identify who is the person, the adult that's responsible for working on that goal with that child, and how is that data going to be communicated. So it's usually done through progress reports. Who is the person that's going to be collecting that data and analyzing it, and how often will measurement occur, and who and to how will the data be communicated. Again, that's all addressing the progress reports. Again, progress reports are issued as frequently as report cards. They speak to the specific goal areas. Spend some time. I used to be guilty of this myself as a parent of a child with an IEP. I wouldn't always read the progress reports. Highly recommend that as a surrogate parent that you spend a few minutes and read those goals. They should be very specific, and if they should be talking about how the child is making progress in relationship to the goal as a whole, but also in those benchmarks or objectives. If your progress report that you receive doesn't address those things, then you can go back to the school and say very nicely, is it possible that you can amend that progress report to identify the exact skill set that we're working on? Because again, data drives the development of IEPs. So this is the service delivery grid. So remember we talked about goal number 2 in the example. That would be here. And then we would identify the type of service, the personnel, the frequency, start date, and end date. So as a surrogate parent, and anybody who is working with students and understanding the service delivery grid, what that really is the recipe. Okay, so we've identified a skill that is deficient or challenging, and so we're going to provide supports. How are we going to do it, and how often do they need support? So a service delivery grid is the catch-all for that information, and it's divided into 3 sections. The first one is consultation. That's adults talking to adults. So a special ed teacher talking to a general ed teacher, or a school social worker or school psychologist consulting with the English teacher so that they have an understanding of how this child is going to manage in an English class. Grid B is services that are provided within the general ed setting. So for people who are not school personnel, that's in the core classes or in the typical experience. So ELA, math, science, social studies, music, gym, all of that kind of stuff. Any of that when a different person other than a teacher is providing support during those classes. That would be found in Grid B. And then in Grid C are all pull-out services. So on occasion, students need more specialized or a quieter environment. And so, for instance, talking about a student's social skills can be embarrassing in the middle of an English class, for instance. So we might go to the school social worker's office to talk about what is happening on the playground, for instance, or how to get along with peers, that kind of stuff. So that would be in a small group or individualized setting, and it would be identified in Grid C of the service delivery grid. So the takeaway is that every goal number needs to be identified and provided within this service delivery grid. There are different cycles for schools. In elementary school, most of them are a 5-day cycle. Middle school and high schools have a tendency to change things up a little bit into 6-day, even 7-day cycles, or a 10-day cycle. What I have asked, because it's very hard as a non-employee or a non-student to understand how these cycles work, what I've asked school districts is, okay, now we have a special ed service delivery plan. Could you then incorporate that into a schedule so that I can see that speech is being met twice a week, or time with the school social worker is 3 times a week right after recess, and then I can see the visual of how that is incorporated, the services of an IEP are incorporated into that child's school day. So just wanted to talk about various goals. So goals for social emotional learning can be kind of difficult. So what I did is in creating this workshop, is go back to those core competencies. This one being self-awareness. So an example of a goal would be, given a complex demand situation, Charlie will be able to identify the feeling he is experiencing and choosing the right coping skills as demonstrated by. So how are we going to know that? And a benchmark, or one of those short little steps, would be to know yourself well enough to identify your own stressors or your own feelings. So that would be an example of a social awareness goal. The next core competency is self-management. So I came up with a couple self-management goals. So when given a frustrating situation, for example, undesired task or demand or undesired peer behavior, with one prompt, Megan will utilize a coping strategy, for instance, taking a deep breath, and return and remain on task with a calm body and mind for 10 minutes with an average of 95% over 8 consecutive school weeks across all classroom environments. That's a lofty goal, but I wanted to make sure that we've identified the areas that we're working on and the data that we're collecting to see if a child is making progress. The other one is, in a classroom environment, Susie will utilize positive self-talk and coping strategies to handle stressful situations or work demands in which she manifests anxious or withdrawn behavior by putting her head down or saying she can't do it, and demonstrated by engaging in that 30-minute activity in a calm and positive manner with one prompt over 2 to 3 occasions. So we're identifying the target behavior and the support that we're providing and what we're looking for and how those skills are going to be demonstrated. A relationship goal. That was kind of tough to come up with. So a benchmark, a measurable goal was, when given scenarios of social conflict, Jimmy will demonstrate problem-solving skills by identifying a problem and generating 2 solutions that are appropriate to that situation in 4 out of 5 trials as measured by data. And then students will work effectively with classmates in completing a small group projects as demonstrated by. So again, teaching a student who may have difficulties managing their own behavior or expectations, or learning how to work collaboratively within a group, addresses that core competency of relationship skills. Oops. Responsible decision making. So when given scenarios of social conflict, will demonstrate problem-solving skills by identifying the problem and generating 2 solutions that are appropriate for that situation as measured by data collection. So responsible decision making is really tough, and it is something that some school districts just assume kids make good decisions. And sometimes you need to have the support of identifying what is a good decision. And also, if you've made a bad decision, how to resolve that, how to correct and work on relationships that may have been dinged about, a decision that a child has made. So how to repair relationships and that kind of stuff. So the ultimate goal of social emotional learning is to know and manage yourself, understand the perspective of others, and relate effectively with them, and then making sound choices about personal and social decisions across all settings and all demands. And most importantly, how to get your smart part back when a child has flipped their lid, and how to calm, but also how to repair. So that was pretty much the presentation, but I wanted to give enough time so that you guys can ask me as many questions as you want.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
So let's see what our questions are. Can you see the questions and you can respond to those?
I can, yes. So,
okay.
So any guidance on how we are to know what is responsible goal for a child? Okay, it goes back to evaluations. So an evaluation will identify a child's strengths and weaknesses. So it's just picking a weakness or an area of challenge for a child and seeing how we can support that. I think that many times it starts with really in this domain identifying emotions and feeling comfortable with emotions and labeling those emotions. Once you can label and identify what that emotion is, then you can work on higher level skills in this case. Um, so curious, my question is specific to when dealing with kids who are deaf and hard of hearing and creating those goals. If seeking out of district placement, can the district utilize the goals from the out of district school as opposed to the school district creating the goals? I'm not sure I understand. It's only thinking if some kids are in preschool programs and those schools would have goals to establish and specific. Um, Pauline, if you could clarify that, if you want to unmute yourself, I don't know if you're able to do that, or if you can send a little bit more clarification. But regardless of the disability, if a child is deaf and hard of hearing, they still need social skills goals, and we need to work on that area.
Hi.
Hi.
It's Paul. Hi. Hi, how are you? I just wanted to so what I was trying to ask is if when you're creating your IEP goals, can you have, like, say for instance, you're in like a parent infant program or something with at the place where you're hoping to be placed, when you're creating the goals, can they just create the goals and then you bring that to your IEP as opposed to the team sitting there creating a goal where creating the goals for your child, where the actual school has goals already in place and they've already established that? Can you just bring their goals to the table?
Absolutely. Bring that information to the school district. It takes a village. And so if other people who are more familiar with
Yeah.
that child already identified areas of weakness and they're working on goals, by all means share that. If you're talking about out of district programs, like if you have a IEP with social emotional goals and the child's in a public school and they need a more restrictive placement, typically that IEP goes to that out of district placement. They spend some time working with that student, and then they may adjust the goals as they see areas of need that may be a little different or were overlooked by the school district or need additional support. Does that answer your question, Pauline?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
No problem. I highly recommend being transparent with the school, explaining what you know and what you don't know. It's okay to say, I don't know. I'm going to have to get more information. I think sometimes you feel that you need to have like gotcha moments. That actually doesn't really work for open and honest communication. So I am completely transparent. So if a child is seeing a therapist, for instance, it's not something you need to hide. It's something that you should probably share with the school district so they have a better idea. And may be able to collaborate with that therapist. Jenny mentioned that Consult A and that service delivery grid is critical for generalizing skills. So when a school social worker is working in the grid C services, meaning they've pulled out and they're talking to students about a skill set that they're working on, if then that social worker can then talk to the general ed teacher and say, this is what we're working on using, turn taking skills. So when you are writing or creating a science project or lab, can you sort of observe and report back to me what you're seeing so that I can then adjust the supports for that child. And how would you love to see how to incorporate collaborative problem solving in this process? Yeah, so couple things. Students with social emotional challenges, many times people who are not familiar with that student assume that they're being bad, for instance. And so one of the things I try to put under additional information is if the student were to be interviewed, for instance, because of a behavior problem, someone who's very familiar with that student would accompany them to that meeting with the principal or vice principal. So that would be the opportunity for, like, for instance, the school social worker, not only to provide support for that student, but also to sort of guide the conversation so that it's not detrimental to the student, and to come up with a way to collaboratively solve a problem. So years ago, I was working for a family who had a student at the one of the tech schools, and he was in horticulture, and he had a very long bus ride. I think it was a 45-minute ride from the school to home, and it was an afternoon in the spring, and he had just finished gym, and he chugged down a giant thing of Gatorade, got on the bus, and 15 minutes into the bus ride needed to go to the bathroom. And so his problem solving was initially to ask for the bus driver if he could pull over so he could go to the bathroom. The bus driver explained, I can't make any special stops. I'm not allowed to do that. So can you sit down and just try to relax? And this student was getting more and more anxious because, oh my gosh, I have to go to the bathroom. So he looked around, and his problem solving skill next was that, oh, I have a potted plant here that I was going to bring home from my mom. I'll just pee in that pot. And then as it was leaking, he panicked, and he opened a window and threw the pot out the window of the bus. Thankfully, nobody got hurt. The pot made it into the woods next to the highway, but he got in a lot of trouble, and he should have. That was not a really great decision. So we went and met with the principal, who was irate. Bus driver was terrified. He could have caused an accident. It was just not a good idea. So the principal made the decision, all right, no more bus for you. You cannot ride the bus. That's a privilege that you have not earned. And until you've learned to behave yourself, you're just not riding the bus. So as an advocate, I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, if he's not riding the bus, he's not coming to school. Parents work. He doesn't drive himself. Not sure I really want him sharing a ride with people. If he's making these type of decisions, I want to make sure that he is sort of taken care of. So the collaborative problem solving was meeting with the principal, allowing him to still provide a punishment, but make it something more reasonable. So the solution was that, yes, he did something wrong. He had to apologize to the bus driver. We also made a decision that, right after gym, we're going to leave a few minutes early to make sure you go to the bathroom so you can make that 45-minute bus ride. But more importantly, we had this student stay after on Friday afternoons and sweep out all the buses, because then he is giving back to the community and he is learning from his mistakes. So that was the collaborative problem solving. So it's, again, thinking outside of the box. I think when you're doing that as a surrogate parent or an advocate, coming up with a solution that still saves face and still meets the criteria of correcting poor choices and behavior. So it worked out really well. Student continued to go to school. He learned how to ride the bus, correctly, and he gave back to the community. So he got to be friendly with the school bus driver, and the school bus driver appreciated that they didn't have to, broom out the bus every Friday.
So Christine, I just wanted to let you know we have about 20 minutes, which is
Okay.
plenty of time to get in some more questions. So if you're comfortable, if you want me to read some questions, or are you all set?
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Bridget.
Okay, so I'm going to just go over to the Q&A section. Do these assessments take the virtual COVID-19 situation into account? Hard to assess peer interaction online, or if they are 6 feet apart?
Absolutely. COVID has put a kink in everybody's expectations.
Right.
So the publisher of those evaluation or assessment tools have many times made exceptions to doing assessment remotely. But you're right, it is very hard to assess peer interaction online. So you may have to create a goal with the understanding that as soon as we get back into school in a traditional setting, that we'll go back and tweak that goal after we do true observations and assessments. In the meantime, we're just going to have to guess about the skill set that they need and work on it.
Right. And we have another one similarly related, especially with congregate setting concerns with privacy of other children living in the group home. How do we do observations of homeschool community and working remotely?
So most of the time when you do an observation in either a program or a group home, you're signing paperwork that you're going to keep the confidentiality of all students. So again, I think that's probably addressed in there. Um, it's learning to be very discreet, and like if you're taking notes, making sure that you don't identify anybody else but the student that you're observing. And then again, with that thread or vision of transparency, I always provide my notes of my observation to the facility, whether it's the group home or the school, so that they have a copy of what I observed. And if maybe I observed something or interpreted an observation incorrectly, then we have a way to have a conversation.
Okay. Another one is, can you speak to the challenge of COVID-19 impacting services and missed services? Being able to make up those missed services. Her student is unable to receive services in the group home due to quarantining and restrictions that workers are under.
So the state in the over the summer came out with advisory on COVID compensatory services, and those are to identify and rectify services that were missing over the summer between March 13th and the end of the school year. And now it's sort of incorporated it into our hybrid learning experience that we're having now from September until whenever we go back in person. So school districts right now are taking data and to determine what the impact of those missed services are. And as a surrogate parent, you should absolutely be part of that discussion to identify what was missing and how it impacted that student. School districts are coming up with a COVID compensatory service flowchart to help us guide our questions and frame our conversation to identify that. So COVID obviously has impacted our ability to provide one-to-one services in person and maintaining safe distances and all that. So again, coming up with a creative solution might be the option. So doing telehealth visits with a therapist or with a school social worker, where maybe there's a private room in the group home where they could go and Zoom into the conversation, for that conversation or that therapeutic support. Again, as a surrogate parent and as an advocate, when I'm complaining about something, I try to come up with a solution. It may not be the right solution, but it is a way to show that you're trying to collaborate and coming up with something to support everyone in this situation. I think you can get in the habit of just only identifying what's wrong. And so I also try to identify what really worked and celebrate those things and appreciate those, because everybody who is supporting this child is doing it with love and compassion, and they want to be there. I think people get frustrated, and if you're always criticizing and only identifying the negatives or the things that are not working, your effectiveness as a surrogate parent goes down. So identify what's working. I celebrate the successes and appreciate that, and then say, okay, now I have a little issue. Maybe we can tweak this.
Right. Another one, does the school counselor in public school write the social emotional goals? Or are you saying parents and or surrogate parents can bring a goal for the IEP?
So goal ideas should definitely be brought in by anybody. So an English teacher can bring in a goal idea, but usually that social emotional adjustment counselor, school psychologist, who's ever supporting that student is ultimately responsible for writing the goal. So one of the things that I was doing in those examples is giving you ways to determine and get an idea of what a measurable goal is. Really, as a surrogate parent, what I would do is focus on the current performance level, what you're seeing the student doing. IEPs are a collaborative effort, and so we're not doing them in silos. We want to look broadly. And so sometimes, I'm sorry, I'm bashing English teachers, but sometimes English teachers only focus on 5th grade English, and they don't see that 5th grade English skills transfer to successful 10th grade MCAS. And so your job is to keep opening their blinders and seeing their efforts and how it's going to pay off in the long term.
Excellent. Jenny's made a good point on COVID compensatory services. That places no blame on why the student hasn't progressed or regressed, and students continue to be eligible, not just through 2019-2020 school year. I think that's an important point.
And the school districts are still working on gathering data, so they have until December 12th or 15th. I forget.
15th, I think. Yep.
15th. Okay. So as surrogate parents, just sort of maybe this is the time to send a friendly reminder. Hey, just want to let you know that I have concerns that this child may be eligible for COVID comp services. Will you let us know when you're ready to discuss?
Right. Great point. Can we incorporate perspective taking into social awareness goal?
Absolutely. Perspective taking is one of those foundational skills that you need to be successful as an adult and in the community as a whole. So how do you do that? That's, the brilliance of these social workers. They're really good at teaching perspective taking, but one of the things is doing it through videos so that a student can observe a situation and then you can say, what do you think this child would have done? And that's in the foundation of teaching perspective taking, is observing first a scripted experience and then trying to play it into other situations that are more natural.
Excellent. When you write remain on task with a calm body and mind, do you have a criteria for that measurement? They could be on task, completing the task, but without a calm body mind. Would this be two different measurements?
It could be, absolutely. With what is a calm body and mind? As an advocate, I would ask, can we describe that a little bit more so that my interpretation of a calm body and mind may be completely different than the math teacher's experience of a calm body and mind. Students, again, who have trauma have a really hard time even sitting still, regardless of whether their mind is calm. So we want to have that conversation that he's a fidgety kid or she's a fidgety girl. And so to expect that they're going to have a calm body and they're just going to sit there and relax might be different. But a calm body for Julie might be that she's kicking the chair, and that's okay because that's her calm body. So yes, I think you're right. We need to explicit that.
Would this be where we would put in accommodations?
Absolutely.
Provide Julie with a standing table or allow for,
Bridget, that's awesome. Yes, exactly. So not only are we doing goals, but we are doing accommodations with this. And so switching and moving, how do we accommodate a child's social emotional needs is very important.
Right. Thanks. How do you differentiate teaching, coping, and identifying emotions with a goal like executive functioning when both can cause emotional challenges and or frustration?
I think you have to break it down.
Yeah.
So students with executive function challenges, you're right, at many different layers, and it's like peeling the onion and peeling it back. So identifying, is it the concept of just asking a demand, asking them to write their homework down? Is that a demand that is, a social emotional trigger, for them? Or is it just that they're not capable of doing it? So again, that's where the observation piece can come into play with a BCBA who can observe how that child is managing when there's a task on board. And then is it just the executive functioning challenges of a child who just doesn't have the skills of learning? So teaching those learning skills. And you're finding a lot of executive challenges right now with this remote learning platform. We have spent years teaching students how to learn in person. We have spent probably 30 minutes on teaching students how to learn virtually. And so again, through this COVID thing, I'm asking goals to be developed on how to manage the virtual learning platforms or various learning platforms, like how to raise your hand during a Zoom, how to put your questions in the Q&A boxes, the chat box, that kind of thing. So it's sort of like the Wild West right now, but we're managing, and I think the social emotional piece is also morphing as we're seeing new stressors.
I think that also it highlights what skills were not generalized
Absolutely.
and what skills have said that were met. But now
Yes.
we're seeing, in the kitchen and at home, and so it can not create new goals, but reassess sort of the
Yes.
validity of generalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that teachers are reporting that kids will not turn on their video. And so you don't know if they're managing. So you can make a goal for that or a benchmark for that. How to ask for a break when you're in a Zoom.
Right.
One student just learned recently to type in on the chat, "Excuse me for a minute, I'm going to grab something to eat." And then he would put that on
That's
and
great.
would acknowledge it. And then he would turn off his video, still listen, go get a
Mhm.
snack.
Yep. I think it's also important to allow that video component too. Some of the social emotional is not being able to see themselves. So if they have their video, there's a way in Zoom to shut off your access to your own video, but also not wanting anyone else to see them.
Yes.
So there has to be some flexibility for our
Absolutely.
kids around the video component.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for teacher match. So again, as a
Mhm.
surrogate parent, identifying the qualities of a good teacher for this student
Mhm.
is very important, and communicating that to the team, but also to the administration at the end of the school year. They're making decisions for placement for next year. So what type of teacher? One that was really
Right.
enthusiastic and, um, jumping up and down in the
Right.
class,
And that can freak some kids out.
but other kids might, really get worried
Right.
about that, triggered by that. So identifying that kind of thing.
Okay.
You can put that information as well in the parent concern statement. So Charlie does best with a calm teacher who is very structured and has a regular, consistent routine. Will help reduce his
Right.
stress.
I think this goes with Jenny pointed out the PLEPs again for performance criteria. And she states no automatic penalty for students' inability, lack of skill to meet XYZ demand. And I think that we can put in the video component of it during remote or.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's see. You see for those is difficulty compensatory services again. I think that's it with our questions
Okay.
in our chat. This has
Great.
been wonderful. And does anyone else have anything they want to throw into chat or Q&A? I hope we've addressed everything, trying to get to both sections.
I was worried about the time constraints. Do we have until 11:15, right?
Yes, we have actually until 11:20:25.
Oh,
So
okay.
this gives people a little more time to.
Oh, good. I was worried that we weren't going to have it. Okay.
This was wonderful. It truly was. There's going to be a survey or an evaluation posted in the chat for people to, let us know how you like this session. It was wonderful, really, Christine. It was great. I love your style. It was good.
Good. Thanks. I appreciate
You're
it.
very welcome. And so we're going to go to Ayanna Presley. Will speak at I think 11:35. We're jam packed, so having this extra time is probably great for everyone. And Pauline has posted the link to the evaluation in your chat, so we'll stay live here. It's also required if you're seeking CEUs. Make sure you've checked in with Jean in the exhibitors hall, as well as doing these evaluations. Let me see, there's one more question. Any ideas for students with ID? Often their needs are overlooked.
Again, I think pairing it back to where the student is, they may be in 8th grade, but their developmental ability might be less. And so getting the service provider to understand that they may be an 8th grader, but maturity level might be at a 4th grade level. So what are those skills of a 4th grader that we need to work?
That's a great point. What tips would you give when schools won't give COVID compensatory services or give minimal compensatory services for COVID?
This COVID compensatory services is like, again, I keep saying like the Wild West. It's all anybody from themselves. There's not consistency involved, but with anything, when you have a disagreement, you can sort of note your disagreement in writing and then go to a dispute resolution
Mhm.
ideas. One of those would be through program resolution system, used to be
Mhm.
called QA, and file a complaint. I just did one the other day against their special ed learning plans were not issued, only
Mhm.
for students that only for parents who requested them. So you use PRS, explain that you don't feel like the compensatory services are adequate or that
Mhm.
the data was flawed or things like that. You can also, that my internet is unstable. So anyhow, use PRS. You can go to
Right.
mediation, all of those things. So you can agree to disagree at the
Mhm.
meeting. And if
I
you
would
do, go ahead.
I would add that the N1, as a result of the meeting, they need to state why they're refusing your request. And in the meeting, you can say, I just want to let you know that you are refusing my request for more compensatory services. I'd like to see that on the N1. And then you know the reason why. Sometimes that can assist.
I became a much better advocate when I stopped having debates with one person at a team. So as
Mhm.
soon as I started having debates, and I referred to it as the popcorn moment, when everybody
Mhm.
else just sits back and eats the popcorn and see who's going to win on that
Yep.
debate, we have a disagreement. So instead of having that debate, I just say the family's position is this. Is it my understanding the position of the school district is this? And could you please include that in the meeting notes? And that's that N1. And so that
Mhm.
identifies the line in the sand, and it allows us to sort of park it and then talk
Mhm.
about other things that are also just as important, but we now know that we're going to go back and resolve or address that sort of line in the sand or that disagreement.
Right. All right. I think we have addressed all of that.
Bridget, thank you very much. And thanks for everyone who attended. I hope it was helpful.
Oh, thank you very much, Christine.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.